In the dead of night, Cecilia awakens suddenly, careful not to disturb her sleeping husband, Adrian. She discreetly slips out of bed, her movements quiet and cautious. As she tiptoes towards the concealed medications hidden beneath the bed, Adrian twitches in his sleep, startling her. She's deeply afraid of waking him. Cecilia proceeds with utmost care to the dressing room, where she fills a duffel bag with clothing and carefully stashes the medications inside. She takes a moment to adjust the hallway camera, ensuring it's still functioning so she can keep an eye on her slumbering husband. Her every move is fraught with anxiety. Entering what appears to be a laboratory, she disables the house cameras and alarm system. The slightest noise sends shivers down her spine, and she frequently glances at the camera to check if Adrian has awoken. With hurried motions, she dons her attire and quietly exits the house through the garage. Zeus, the family dog, follows her outside, initially startling her. She removes the electronic collar when the dog triggers the vehicle alarm. Cecilia makes a swift dash for the fence, fear gnawing at her. Climbing over, she hurries through the woods until reaching a road, where she anxiously awaits her sister, Emily, who is to pick her up. After a tense moment, Cecilia finally enters her sister's car just as her furious spouse emerges from the house, yelling after her and shattering a glass pane. As they drive away, he discovers her diazepam medication left behind on the ground. 2 weeks later, Cecilia finds herself at a friend's house, still gripped by fear. James, a friend, encourages her to step outside to retrieve the mail. As she begins to open the mailbox, the sudden appearance of a running man startles her, sending her scurrying back inside. The following day, Cecilia's friend is engaged in home renovations, and Cecilia is vigilant, covering her computer camera when the doorbell unexpectedly rings. Emily, her sister, has arrived at the front door, prompting Cecilia's concern that her spouse has tracked her there. However, Emily bears exciting news, displaying an article on her phone reporting that Cecilia's husband is no longer alive. Relieved, Cecilia confides in James and Emily, revealing how her husband manipulated every aspect of her life, from her appearance to her thoughts and speech. His abuse extended far beyond physical violence. The following day, she confidently retrieves the mail by herself, receiving commendations from James and his daughter, Sydney. Among the letters, one is addressed to her, piquing their curiosity. Later, Cecilia and Emily are seen at a legal office where Adrian's lawyer brother announces the deceased's final instructions. These include a substantial bequest of $5 million to Cecilia, contingent upon her avoiding criminal charges or being labeled as mentally disturbed. That night, Cecilia surprises Sydney and James with gifts to express her gratitude for their support. James receives a giant letter, while Sydney receives a bank account with enough funds to attend a fashion school. They celebrate together, but later, Cecilia experiences an eerie feeling that someone is watching her. The next morning, as James departs for work, he asks Cecilia to wake up Sydney. She does so, inadvertently leaving the stove on. A breakfast mishap causes a fire, but Sydney quickly extinguishes it with a fire extinguisher. Later that day, Cecilia finds herself alone in the house but senses something amiss. She conducts a thorough search throughout the entire house, discovering nothing unusual. Suddenly, she hears the front door creak open. Cecilia cautiously checks the entrance, but there's no one there. Still feeling uneasy, she suddenly notices a second breath beside her. That same night, Cecilia and Sydney are asleep in Sydney's room when their covers are abruptly pulled off, and the room's lights flicker on and off. Cecilia wakes up, thinking she sees a figure briefly but realizes it's only Sydney's mannequin. She proceeds to pick up the fallen covers from the floor and becomes convinced that someone is sitting in the chair next to her. Cecilia's distress grows as she throws her covers at the perceived intruder, only to find no one there. Her attempts to pull the covers back reveal an eerie resistance as if someone is standing on them. Shaken, Cecilia calls out for James, inadvertently waking Sydney. James rushes into the room, but neither he nor his daughter sees anyone. They try to soothe Cecilia, encouraging her not to let Adrian's memory haunt her. During her turmoil, Cecilia attends a job interview. However, the situation takes a disturbing turn when the interviewer begins to flirt with her. His demeanor shifts abruptly when he notices Cecilia's fear, and he asks to examine her work. Opening her bag, Cecilia is horrified to discover her work missing. Her agitation escalates, and she collapses. James finds himself in the hospital with Cecilia as the doctor instructs her to take it easy until her blood test results come in. Meanwhile, Cecilia is in the shower when the phone rings. Answering the call, she learns from her doctor that excessive amounts of diazepam are present in her system. Her eyes fall upon a diazepam bottle on the bathroom sink, bearing a bloodied fingerprint. Subsequently, Cecilia brings James with her to see Adrian's brother. She confides in them about the diazepam bottle, claiming that Adrian placed it there. However, the brother dismisses her allegations. Cecilia then takes a more unconventional stance, expressing her belief that Adrian is not truly dead and has discovered a technique to become invisible, suggesting that his brother is aware of it. Adrian's brother remains unimpressed, leaving James taken aback. He shares a picture of Adrian's lifeless body, revealing that he was also relieved by his brother's death. Cecilia visits Emily, but their conversation takes a bitter turn as her sister reveals that she read Cecilia's disturbing email about her. Cecilia asserts that Adrian, not herself, sent that email. Emily, skeptical, suggests that Cecilia seek professional help. Later that night, Cecilia checks her email sent items and discovers the email she claims Adrian sent to Emily. Sydney enters the room and finds Cecilia sobbing on the floor. After offering some comforting words, something suddenly strikes Sydney as she stands up. She quickly calls for her father, convinced that Cecilia is responsible. Despite Cecilia's protests, they leave her alone in the house. As Cecilia is left by herself, she becomes convinced that Adrian is nearby and begins shouting for him. In a desperate attempt to reveal his presence, she spreads a bag of coffee across the floor in one of the rooms, positioning herself at the opposite end of the entrance. Cecilia talks to Adrian, pleading to be left alone. Then, she gets an idea and calls Adrian's phone. The ringing sound reverberates through the ceiling. Climbing into the ceiling, Cecilia searches for any sign of him but finds nothing. She calls the phone again, and it leads her to discover Adrian's keys, a knife, and her own design work. Just as she hears a noise behind her, Cecilia grabs a piece of paint and hurls it in that direction. As Cecilia opens the ceiling, revealing the man's contours, she descends from the ceiling and begins searching for him. Suddenly, she hears water running in the kitchen, where the sink is filled with paint. An invisible hand grabs and violently lifts her, throwing her around the house. They engage in a fierce struggle, and Cecilia is chased relentlessly. The invisible presence attempts to strangle her, but she manages to fight it off and ultimately escapes from the house. Cecilia hails an Uber and instructs the driver to take her to the house she once shared with Adrian. Upon arrival, she asks the Uber driver to wait while she enters the house. Zeus, the dog, accompanies her as they head to the basement laboratory. Cecilia navigates the room, focusing on a mysterious gadget. She utilizes a tablet on the wall to deactivate the gadget, slowly revealing an invisibility suit. As Cecilia starts removing the suit from the mannequin, Zeus detects something amiss and barks, alerting her to an intruder's presence. Cecilia retreats to the dressing room and bedroom, pursued by the invisible man. He opens the door but ironically fails to spot her immediately. She escapes while the dog continues to bark at the unseen threat. Back in the Uber, Cecilia calls her sister Emily, urgently requesting a meeting that night. Cecilia waits nervously in a restaurant, her gaze fixed on an empty chair. When Emily arrives, Cecilia shares her discovery from Adrian's house, which could prove he's still alive. Suddenly, a floating knife appears, taking Emily's life in an instant. The restaurant patrons panic, and Cecilia is pinned down and arrested. She's taken to an asylum, vehemently proclaiming her innocence and insisting that Adrian killed her sister. She claims to know he's there, all while staring at the empty corners of the room. She's sedated and left alone, but footsteps approach her. In a subsequent interrogation, Cecilia tells James that she has evidence regarding Adrian but cannot disclose it because he's present in the room, though invisible. The other detective exits, leaving Cecilia and James alone. She confides in him, expressing guilt, but James reveals his own remorse. The next day, Adrian's brother visits Cecilia at the asylum, informing her that due to criminal charges and potential mental incompetence, she has forfeited the right to Adrian's wealth. He offers her two options: sign a document and relinquish the money, or have the baby and return to Adrian for a new life. Cecilia declines and discreetly steals one of his pens while he's not looking. Adrian's brother warns that he'll return in 3 days for her final decision. Later that night, after the orderly thoroughly checks Cecilia's room and departs, she steps into the shower. With the pen in hand, she begins to cut her veins, saying, "You won't get the baby." Suddenly, the invisible man seizes her hand, and she stabs him repeatedly with the pen. A security guard enters, noticing the damaged suit, but before he can act, the invisible man turns the stun gun on the guard. Cecilia attempts to flee but is quickly intercepted by 2 guards who escort her back to her room. The invisible man reappears, systematically eliminating each guard without them realizing what's happening to them. After disposing of the last guard on that floor, the invisible man drops his weapon. Cecilia seizes the opportunity, running after him and retrieving the gun. She chases him to the stairwell, firing at him. Both of them exit the facility and find themselves outside in the pouring rain. Cecilia, gun in hand, searches for the invisible man, determined to confront him. She hears a noise and heads toward it, while security guards pursue her closely. Near her, there's an open trunk, and she cautiously approaches, suspecting he might be hiding inside. Suddenly, he grabs her, initiating a fierce struggle. He threatens to harm her loved ones, including Sydney, if she doesn't comply. Cecilia persists in pursuing him. As they reach the perimeter fence, the invisible man speeds towards Cecilia in his car, and she fires at him, causing another vehicle to crash. Cecilia commandeers the crashed car, continuing her relentless pursuit. During the chase, she calls James, urging him to return to the house to protect Sydney. The invisible man arrives at the house and enters a room where Sydney awakens and retrieves pepper spray from her bag. She sprays him, causing him to fall over, but he quickly recovers and seizes her. Cecilia arrives just in time, blasting him with a fire extinguisher and fatally shooting him. She removes the mask, revealing the dead man to be Adrian's brother. Inside Adrian's residence, calls for aid are heard, and a tactical police squad enters. Adrian is bound when they break down a cellar wall. Later, James explains how he was held captive, but Cecilia is skeptical, believing that Adrian manipulated his brother to frame her. She returns to the house that night, and Adrian eagerly awaits her, though she is less enthusiastic about seeing him. They sit down for dinner, and Adrian tries to be open with her, apologizing and claiming to have learned his lesson. Cecilia presses him for a confession about his actions, but he insists that his brother is the mastermind. Cecilia insists on his guilt, and James listens from outside the house. The two engage in a heated argument, and Adrian shifts back to his controlling demeanor. Cecilia retreats to the bathroom to compose herself, and Adrian remains seated at the table. Growing restless as she takes longer than expected, he takes his own life. Cecilia returns moments later and contacts emergency services. She then pulls away, sitting in the blind zone of the security cameras, and watches him die. After hearing about the incident, James rushes to the house and finds Cecilia outside. She tells him that Adrian committed suicide, but James notices the outfit in her duffel bag and wonders if she had planned it all along. Cecilia remains silent on the matter as she departs, leaving everything behind.